Welcome to the Hidden Bookcase. Come through and get cozy. Pick a book, your favourite book. That's the one that opens this room. Inside, you'll find a warm fire, a loving cat, and a wide skylight to the stars.
And a dangerously high to be read pile.
I'm Morgan. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a mermaid landlocked on foreign shores.
I'm Soren. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a sentient gemstone riding a pink lion into battle.
I'm Anya. I use they or she pronouns, and I am a bolt of lightning saving the world.
Soren and I have been friends for over a decade, and the two of us are always swapping books.
Usually, the two of us take it in turns to recommend one another a favourite read. Today, we're talking about fat representation in fantasy in celebration of Fat Liberation Month.
So let's get into it.
So we have the wonderful Anya Josephs with us today. Hi, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for asking me to join on the show. I'm so excited to be talking with you all.
Anya, would you like to tell us about your work, your vibe, your activism, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I would love to. To the listeners out there, hello. I am a lot of different things. I am a writer, primarily of speculative fiction, so science fiction and fantasy. I have been fortunate enough to have short work in a number of different venues. All of those things are in my bio, which is on my website. And I'm also the author of a young adult queer fantasy novel called Queen of All. I try to write work that is really inclusive while also dealing with many of the challenges and struggles that we have here in the real world, while also hopefully bringing some of the joy and delight and comfort to readers that I found in books when I was young, particularly when I write YA. That's one of my goals. Outside of my work as a writer, my day job is that I am a psychotherapist. I work at a practice that focuses on treating eating disorders and disorders of body image. My specific kind of sub-focus within that population is people who develop eating disorders who are plus-sized or fat, who have a really, really hard time accessing care. So this is a subject that is dear to my heart, that I'm very, very passionate about.
We found you through your article in Reactor magazine. What I found particularly interesting about that article, it focuses very heavily on young adult representation, which was really cool to see, because I feel like young adult representation is something we've said before on the show, often kind of paves the way for representation. We're a queer science fiction and fantasy show, for those who are listening for the first time, and I feel like we got to see that kind of representation growing in the young adult genre even before it did in the adult genre. You yourself are an author, as you mentioned, and have written a young adult novel with a fat protagonist. As a writer, what is your approach to sort of putting that representation on the page? I feel like that's a big question to start with, but if it's not too mountainous.
It's a really big question. So I worked on Queen of All for a really, really long time. I started writing this book when I was about 12 years old. I was not 12 years old when it was published. It was probably over a decade of, I mean, obviously not a single word that I wrote of this like initial story survives in the final published draft. But the characters and the ideas are the same, and they came out of the ideas that were, and the experiences that were most important in my life when I was at that very lower end of YA readership age, which was the idea of feeling fundamentally different than the people around me and fundamentally excluded and misunderstood. And like, that was the experience that inspired me to want to write this book. It was the experience that led me to love fantasy in the first place, because that was where, as a young reader, I found so many stories of people who were misunderstood or excluded or not accepted by those around them, who ended up like the thing that made them different was actually the thing that made them powerful or special or like able to do a lot of good in the world. I think was a really important part of that for me. And that created what one of my biggest problems was in writing Queen of All, which is that like I wanted to create a fantasy world where like the character's body size wasn't important. I wanted to create like a world without fatphobia. I think I'm sure this is something that has come up in discussions of like queer SFF, is there's always the decision between like, is this a world where homophobia exists or not? If you're going to create a new world from scratch, you don't have to import all of the biases that exist in our world, but you do have to grapple with whether you are or not. And for the longest time, I really wanted Queen of All to take place in a world where fatphobia didn't exist. And I constructed the story that way. There's actually two fat protagonists in Queen of All. The narrator, Jenna, who is, I wouldn't say a self-insert quite, but definitely the character that like, a self-insert of me as I was at age 12, if I, as an adult, aged that person up a little bit and had some, some of the self-reflection that you gain in adulthood. And then Jenna's best friend, Cece, is also fat, but she is not somebody who struggles with self-confidence or feeling other than or feeling rejected. She's very like confident and powerful character. And she's also considered to be extremely beautiful by everybody she encounters in the entire book. And so originally, like as I was writing it, Jenna was not going to be fat. She was going to be average sized, maybe skinny, and have like a bunch of other things that she was insecure about. But that just really felt like very untrue to the experiences that had led me to want to write this book. I realized at one point that like two people can have the same experience of marginalization, but experience it in a completely different way. And that actually maybe having these two fat main characters whose experience with fatness is so opposite from each other in terms of how they are perceived by the world, in terms of how they relate to themselves, could be a good thing, actually.
It's really interesting that you say that. We haven't just recorded, but I've just been editing, so it feels fresh in my mind, a episode about disability representation in fantasy. And one thing that we were all talking about was knee-jerk reaction that we weren't allowed to have more than one character that filled that role. But then also the value in having multiple characters who experience their disabilities differently in that case. And I feel like that's something, I'm only halfway through Queen of All at the moment. That was something that immediately like stood out to me. I was really pleasantly surprised, honestly, because I was like, oh, like I knew the protagonist was fat because that was how I ended up finding your book in the first place, was your article. But I didn't know that Cece was going to be as well. And I was like, oh, this is already really interesting. And there's already so much more room for nuance here.
Yeah, and I think it represents the real world as well. I think there's been a lot of conversation in recent years about like tokenization in various kinds of media. In every TV show, there's like the one gay friend who is there so that you know that the creators are cool with gay people. Certainly you hear that like if there's multiple queer characters that is like somehow unrealistic. But if you go into the real world, like queer people hang out with each other. We are like part of the same community. And I think that a piece of advice I often give when people are on a journey of understanding how to like accept and love their own bodies is like, well, do you have fat friends? Is there a fat community in your life? Or are you alone in having this experience? And so I think depicting a story where, unlike many of the other SFF books I can think of that have fat protagonists, whether that's good or bad representation, it's usually just kind of one person alone in that experience. And it's not something that is shared or where those differences in how an individual experiences it can be explored. So it wasn't something I set out to do when I was writing the book, but is something that I would love to see more of. You know, there could be 8 fat characters in a book, and they could all have different experiences of marginalization. They could all have different relationships with their bodies, with the world around them. Different people could perceive them in different ways.
It's actually crazy that I literally cannot think of a single book except for yours where there are like 2 fat main protagonists.
Neither can I. I'm trying to think about it.
Yeah.
I got nothing.
I think I'm in the same boat, unfortunately.
Wow.
Yeah, in general, before this episode, because we have our little introduction gimmick, I was very upset to realise how much I was racking my brains for anyone. I feel like it is so underrepresented and so not discussed. It's just baffling when you actually sit down and think about it.
Yeah, everyone kind of just holds up like, oh, Six of Crows has Nina. And then that's as far as the list goes. And you're like, okay, that's one.
I mean, when I pitched this article to Reactor, I didn't pitch it with like what the list was going to be, just with the idea and why I thought it was important. And they accepted it and I sat down to write it. And I was like, okay, there's Nina from Six of Crows. There's Tris Chandler from the Circle of Magic books. I just bought The Witch King and that had a fat person on the cover. So that's 3. And I couldn't think of any more. And I realized people listening to the podcast cannot see the 1,200 books that I have on the bookshelf sitting right behind me as I record this. But I have read a lot of books. I've read an awful lot of speculative fiction books. And the list of fat characters that I could generate without having to like really sit down and do research and ask other people and pull things off the bookshelf and look through them was 3 characters long.
Yeah, which is just wild. I feel like more recently, I feel like I've been seeing a little bit more fat representation in like the romance genre, like contemporary romances. But I feel like speculative fiction has yet to catch up on that front.
Yeah. Speculative fiction has yet to catch up on that front. I wouldn't say I think there's like a sea change around this. I think that there is starting to be some awareness that it would be a kind of representation that people could keep an eye out for. It could be something that people could think about when they think about diversity or representation in fantasy. But yeah, I would give contemporary romance the gold star for being the furthest ahead of all of the genres in understanding the importance of this representation to readers, and also like understanding the interesting and important stories that can come up when this aspect of the human experience is incorporated into what's being written. And I would say that speculative fiction is lagging behind, and maybe particularly adult speculative fiction.
I think also there's been a lot of talk around contemporary romance and sort of the cover issue of like all the covers look exactly the same, they're all just cartoon white people on the cover, but the affordance that does give is you get to see body types on the cover. It's like very obvious from the off, like, oh, this book has fat representation, that's amazing, and you can like find it a lot more easily, which I feel like is a conversation we've had around like Black characters on covers and like being able to see yourself on a cover for the first time. And I feel like that is a good thing that contemporary romance is doing, is actually like putting it out there and putting it on the cover and not being shy about it, which is really cool.
And in fact, that like very samey style, the kind of lightly cartoony, illustrated, bright colors, bold font, two people standing on the cover, really gives you a clear representation of what the characters' body types and race and disabilities, if there are visible physical disabilities, represent. All of that is right on the cover, where readers can find it. In SFF, which might or might not be character driven at all, who a character is or what they represent or what they experience might or might not be central to the story. It's not as frequently on the cover.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it is.
I suppose that compounds the problem to some extent if it is representation that you're looking for. It could be that it's out there somewhere, but unless somebody's mentioned it specifically in a review or an article or something, you might not necessarily be able to see it if there's an abstract cover. And I mean, we're big fans of sort of abstract representative covers on the show. We always have a little cover segment whenever we cover a book and chat about the cover. But I feel like there are some drawbacks to that approach. Yeah.
My book's cover is about as like abstractly non-representational as anything could possibly be. The things it has on it are like a crown and a sword. So you know it's a fantasy book, but you don't know anything about it. You don't even know that the main characters exist, let alone anything about them or what their bodies look like. I do think it's difficult as well because, you know, you mentioned unless you find this in an article or review. A couple of years ago when I was putting this article together, I found 0 other articles that had been written on this subject. Whereas with some other kinds of representation, we're starting to see booksellers might pull together a table of feminist fantasy reads or the best of queer YA fantasy. I feel like I see it every independent bookstore during Pride Month. I've never seen a body positivity or like a fat positivity table put together, or like recommendations put out there in the room for readers to find. That doesn't mean it's never happened, but it's never happened in any of the many bookstores I've been in.
Yeah, absolutely. I've never seen anything like that either. And I feel like I haven't seen, like, there's so many blogs that are just, like, dedicated to, like, sapphic books or trans books, niches like that, even, like, within the queer community, which, to be fair, did not exist, like, even 10 years ago. I feel like there's a lot more, and there's enough substance as well for those types of blogs to work with now, but I definitely haven't seen anything analogous.
Which I think is always such an important point, is, like, when I think about how fast things can change, you know, when I started writing Queen of All, I couldn't have named a fantasy. That's not true. I could have named one fantasy book with a queer protagonist in it. And now there are like literally thousands. That was a while ago, but it's, you know, it's within my lifetime that there has been this like explosion of representation and visibility. Things can change quickly.
I feel like that leads us well into what are you actually hopeful for the future? Like, what would you like to see more of? Or I guess not necessarily more of if it doesn't exist, but some of in SFF.
When I was just saying that about queer representation in SFF, I was starting to kind of like hedge that, like, of course, not all of that representation is good. So there's good and bad. But even though there's surely been some like terrible queer rep in some of the many, many queer SFF books that have come out in the last 10 years, the fact that there's so much more than there used to be that might not be as good, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it's still overwhelmingly such a good thing that there is more. And I guess that's what I would like to see. That's what I would like to see, is just more writers taking this into consideration as something that might like be a factor in how they think about diversity and representation in their worlds, not feeling afraid to represent this as an aspect of their own experience. I could name a lot more fat writers than I can fat protagonists. Not that people have to speak from their own experience, but I hope that more people will feel comfortable doing so. I believe that like if there's more, there will be more that's good. There will be more that's intersectional. There will be more that represents more different kinds of identities, more different kinds of experiences. Yeah, I just want more people to tackle this. It's a real writing challenge, I will say, as a writer, because our language here in the real world about describing people's bodies is so loaded. I use the word fat. I use it to describe myself. I use it as a political activist term. But for many people, that would be a horrible thing to think about calling themselves. And it would be really distressing. And then basically every kind of euphemism or other word I can think of, plus sized, overweight. Somebody feels assured by that and somebody hates it more than anything else. So, we don't even have good language to have this conversation here in this world. If you're creating a new world from scratch, what words do you use? I think that's a challenge, and I hope more people will take that challenge up because I'm excited to see all of the things that could be invented.
I feel like that answers one of our later questions fairly well. How can writers deconstruct fatphobia while creating speculative settings?
I can say more about that. I've always got more to say about it.
Go for it.
I think deconstruct is really the perfect word because if you're writing most kinds of speculative fiction, there are some kinds of speculative fiction that really take place in our world, but something like a second world fantasy or a portal fantasy or far future science fiction, something where you're creating a new world, you're constructing that world, and you are going to construct it with some of the elements that we have in the real world and some elements that are different. And as a writer, you have this like amazing power to make the choice of what elements that you want to bring in to the new world you are constructing. You don't have to bring fatphobia into it as one of those constructs exactly the way that we have it in our world. You can deconstruct it and you can do with those deconstructed parts what you wish. You can import wholesale the biases that we have here. You can try to not incorporate them at all, but that's really difficult because you, the writer, and your eventual readers will have some of those biases. But you can also think really critically about like, okay, why do we have fatphobia here in this world? Well, we have a long legacy of racism and ableism that is very fond of certain very specific kinds of bodies. The patriarchy has benefited enormously from diet culture as a means of controlling women in particular and everybody in general. We have a certain kind of medical model that valorizes specific ideas of health. So all of these things exist in our world. Which of those things exist in the new world that you as a writer are constructing? And what might be the impacts of those things? What might be better? What might be worse? I think just thinking critically about how fatphobia, like any other element of a story, I think we have a tendency as writers, and I will not recuse myself from this, to think about how the language system or the food culture or the currency of our new world is created and constructed, but we don't think about how the relationship that people have to their bodies is constructed in that world, because we tend to think of the embodied experience as being just a fact rather than something that's constructed by the world around us. So I think pulling apart, deconstructing like the body from the way that the body is understood and received by society is a good place for writers to start.
That's beautifully put. Particularly thinking about medieval fantasies and fantasies that are sort of set in a time that is not modern. It is so interesting that bias that is so global now and is so connected to all of the systems of colonialism and racism and things that exist is almost always imported into these settings when often it kind of doesn't make sense. I found a website called The Body Project, which is a lot of research that's been compounded by researchers at Bradley University. There's so many examples, even like in the 90s, of cultures where fat is the beauty standard. They mentioned in Jamaica, a woman buying pills designed to increase their appetite to help them gain weight. And that's 1993. Like, this is so recent.
Yeah. If we look across the whole span of like all of history and every culture, fat was the beauty standard in some places, but there have been very, very few places where the beauty standard is exactly what it is now. Even beyond just fat versus thin as a beauty standard, there are so many different things that so many cultures have idealized over the whole history of the whole world. And I think writers could learn some really interesting things that could enrich the worlds that they're creating. And readers could benefit a lot from seeing those things. There's a lot to draw inspiration from.
Absolutely. We're very big on drawing on history for world building in general. And then one thing I've been thinking about recently, I'm half South Asian, so there's a long history of famine in that community, mostly due to colonialism, which has led to an epigenetic factor where South Asian people tend to store fats and not have a lot of lean muscle. And it's so interesting to me that I've never seen something like that come up in a fantasy novel. Like, how often is a famine like a part of the recent history or even ongoing a novel? And I feel like people just make the immediate assumption of like, oh, well, if you're starving, then you must be skinny. And I'm like, there's a genetic component here. If you're bringing science and history into your world building, I feel like it's going to end up being a richer experience for the reader at the end of the day. And, hopefully you can do something more interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is always such a great point when talking about representation and inclusion in writing. It's not just that it's the right thing to do. I mean, it is the right thing to do, and it is important to do it because it's the right thing. But it's also like the world is so interesting, and there are so many places to draw inspiration from, looking a little bit outside of the values and ideas and ideals of this exact moment, particularly with medieval fantasy, like the version of the medieval world that gets transmitted by fantasy writers to other fantasy writers, rather than actually looking back at like the history of an incredibly complex, complicated era. For instance, the idea that like there were no fat people before like, I don't know, the year 1980 or something. If you look back at some primary sources, there's like a wealth of information to draw from that could take one's writing to some really interesting places.
That as a conception is just so wild to me. I'm like, we have statues from before the birth of Christ that definitely indicate that that's just simply not the case.
Oh yeah, I mean, people say this all the time, that like people are fat now because they're either more gluttonous than they used to be or because of all the bad food that's in our food system, and people didn't used to be fat. When in fact, probably the first work of art ever created by a human being was the like Venus figurines, which were, I think they're about 40,000 years ago, which are little statuettes of fat women.
Honestly, it feels, having the take of like, oh, people just didn't exist, feels kind of like being a flat earther or something to me. I'm like, you're just ignoring evidence.
The classic thing of people being like, yeah, it's not historically accurate, yada, yada, yada. And it's like, I don't think you actually know that. Do you actually care about historical accuracy? Or do you need to examine your biases?
Yeah, I think the argument about historical accuracy, I mean, first of all, just like wholly uninteresting to me as an idea in fantasy, because like
it's fantasy.
Dragons, not historically accurate. Magical powers, not historically accurate. I think that we have the ability to imagine whole new things. History can be a source, but trying to adhere to the medieval past as imagined by writers who read Tolkien and then imagined based on that. Do something new, do something different.
I do also think, though, that there is a lot of value in, obviously, in Queen of All, there are fatphobic sentiments that are surrounding our protagonists. You've folded into the world building that it's maybe like a bit of a newer thing, like that comment from the seamstress where she's like, oh, there's this trend at the moment kind of thing. But I feel like it is still very validating to see your exact struggles replicated in SFF, so I definitely feel like there's room for both. Like, as a queer person, I've definitely read fantasy novels, or like what's coming up in my brain right now is Dragon Age, which has a very deep exploration of homophobia and conversion therapy with one of the characters. And you could easily make the argument, well, why is that even happening? But I remember that being like very important to me at the time of playing. So I feel like there's always room for both. But I feel like that comes back to a point of like, we just need more.
Yeah, I mean, I think also that's why I like the, how can you deconstruct this rather than how can you remove it? I think particularly in the kind of YA space, there's been a lot of pressure, particularly around like the year that Queen of All was coming out. There was a lot of talk about like good representation and particularly a lot of pressure on fantasy authors to create worlds where the biases we experience in this world didn't exist. And I think there's a place for that. I mean, I think everyone deserves the chance to experience the fantasy of like, what if this burden that I have to carry through life that I like didn't ask for was removed? What if there were a world where I could imagine that that didn't exist? And I think that's so important. But I also think that there has to be space within the genre for it to be a way to explore what would it be like for this character that I relate to, that does these incredible things, that has these incredible powers, or that goes on this incredible journey, shared this experience with me. And like, I know for me in the real world, the experience of being queer cannot be separated out from the experience of queer phobia. The experience of being fat cannot be separated out from the experience of fat phobia. We can imagine a world where those things would be disentangled, but we can also imagine a lot of interesting and important ways in which they do entangle that I think it's really valuable to represent as well. Just more would be better.
It's the luxury of choice. I remember being like a queer reader when I was like much younger and being like, oh my God, it's got a queer character. I have to read it. And it doesn't matter how well it represents anything. I just need to read it because it's the only chance I'm going to have. And now there's a luxury of choice. You can get some really bad representation. You get good representation. You can get different representations. And there is room for that.
It didn't matter how good the representation is. It also didn't matter like how good the work was. Like, do you remember the era when like, I don't know if we grew up in quite the same online era, but like, you know, posts would be going viral on Tumblr that like, oh, you should watch like whatever terrible sitcom because there's one episode where like the neighbor comes in and he's gay. So we all have to go watch this show because it's like, there's like a little teeny tiny breadcrumb. And we all have to swarm it because we're all starving.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. My Tumblr dash would regularly do the sapphic migration, as it's known, and be like, oh, we're watching that show at the moment because in season 7, there's one scene. So we're all watching this now.
There's one scene where 2 girls kiss, and admittedly it's because one of them is possessed by a demon. But it's the best we have.
It's all we've got.
And now it's not the best we have. Now we have the ability to watch gay shows and read queer books that are also good and also relevant to what we like in a book.
We were talking a little bit about this in the disability episode as well. You wouldn't pitch a book based on like, oh, the main couple is cishet or the main character is abled. And then obviously if you've got more, then you actually have that freedom to be like, oh, okay, so like, I want to read about fairies today. Let me go read this one. There's a protagonist, fantastic. Or maybe I feel like reading about dragons today. Great. But when there's so little, then you're just like, oh, I'll read this one just because it's got the crumbs. That's all I'm getting.
Right. Like people who hate second world fantasy or like fast-paced action-y plots or like don't want to have to remember a bunch of like made up places and fake magic words should be able to like pick up my book and be like, I don't like these things. I'm not going to read this book because it has these things in it. I'm going to go read a different book with a fat main character in it because I like that book better. Not like this is your one and only option. Not that it's the one and only, but you know, one of very few.
Yeah.
I feel like it did take me researching for this episode to sort of realize how bad it was, honestly.
Yeah. Like I said, I felt the same way when I was doing research for the article. I was just kind of like, well, surely I am not the first person in this era where like everyone was pitching their books on the basis of representation to an extent that for a while it did kind of crowd out like what are the books actually about. Particularly there was a lot of pressure on marginalized authors to do that and to use that as a selling point for their work, whether they prefer to do so or not. And I was like, surely I can't be the first person to have the idea that like this is a kind of representation people might like to see. I can't be the first person to think about this. And I'm not, but it's kind of surprising how bad it is out there.
Not just that the representation isn't there, but I feel like it's something that's under-discussed. Like doing research, even for like the disability episode, I could go on YouTube and see like a couple of people talking about, even specifically in fantasy, disability representation. And I was like, oh, there's nothing on YouTube for this, so I guess I'll go read essays rather than consume it in this way. It was surprising.
Yeah.
Maybe not surprising, but it was disappointing.
Jumping off from that, I guess, do you have any favourite fat characters that you want to mention? And what did you like about them?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this in the article, and again in my intro, I was thinking about Tristana Chandler, who's from Tamora Pierce's Circle of Magic books. I actually did not think of her immediately when I was writing the article. It was when I was going around on my bookshelves and pulling out books and being like, surely I must own at least one book. I have all of these books. There must be at least one with a fat character in it. Triss is not represented as fat on any of the covers. I mean, there's been a lot of different editions, so maybe one, but certainly not the version I have. But she's a really cool character. She's feared and mistrusted by the people around her because she has this like lightning magic that she can't totally get control over. A central theme of the book is her learning to get that control. And what I liked about like exploring this as a avenue of like fat representation is I think there's some scenes, I'm trying to remember now, I think there are some scenes where she does think about feeling othered or different than because of her body size. But for the most part, I think that it works really well as representation on this kind of symbolic level, where she's constantly conscious of herself as somebody who's different and somebody who's the recipient of judgment and somebody whose body is perceived as dangerous by other people in this way. But textually, it's not about fatness. Textually, it's about her cool magic weather powers. I think that kind of like symbolic representation, I didn't mention that on the list of like ways to deconstruct, but I think it can be really powerful that then the reader is like getting the representation of their own experience and getting the representation of what that experience is like without having to directly import the fat phobia into the world.
That reminds me of one of my favourite characters recently, who's not from a book, but from the Disney show The Owl House, Willow. I really appreciated that, like, she starts out as the character who, like, gets bullied and is very down on herself and doesn't have self-confidence. But it's not anything to do with her body, presumably because the setting, we're not really given much insight into like what is typically seen as attractive there, but there's like demons hopping around and stuff. So, you know, it's going to be pretty different. And then seeing her sort of come into herself is so fantastic. I'm hopeful that like a kid can watch that and connect to her and be like, oh yeah, she looks like me. And also I can be confident too. But again, you do get that benefit of like the escapism. Like it's not about that. That's not the reason that she's insecure. But you still get to see her like become a complete badass, basically.
Yeah, it's just another like really cool way to solve this challenge of like, how do we represent an experience that is so rooted in the experience of bias without erasing or recreating the bias, without like forcing people to re-encounter bigotry in a way that's unnecessary, while also not erasing that out of existence unless escapism is the purpose. I think symbolism is like one more cool route to do that. There's so many different tools in a writer's tool chest.
I feel like it's also important to note that when you're doing it from a perspective of like escapism from your own sort of experience, but still getting to see that experience, it's very different to sort of like, for example, you see a lot of white authors importing racist stuff into their world in a way of like, because it's happening to white characters, it's like importing it to aestheticize that experience almost. They're doing it from a, wouldn't it be up if this happened to white people?
Yeah, I always try to avoid analogizing between different experiences of oppression. I do see a similar thing happen with representation of body size in books in general, and especially in SFF. The number of scenes I have read where the main character looks in a mirror and is like, no one could ever love me because I am just so skinny. I am just too skinny. And everybody in my fantasy world in which I live hates skinny people. And they all judge me for being so thin, except for my big boobs and my big blue eyes and my long blonde hair. This trope really exhausts me. Not that there couldn't be an interesting exploration of different kinds of bias against different kinds of bodies and different kinds of worlds. But this trope of I am received as being ugly by the people around me in my second world fantasy existence because I conform so perfectly to the beauty standard of the world in which the reader is living, I think is something I could never read again and be happy.
There is a single instance I can think of where that was actually pulled off well, and every other time it's just been awful.
What's the instance? I'm so curious.
I think Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo, specifically the arc that Alina goes through. Because at the beginning, she's all like, I'm so small and dainty and like nobody could ever love me. And then it turns out it's actually because she's been damaging her body irrevocably and she needs to get over that. And like she actually is very sick by this world's standards. And then once she comes into her own power, she gains weight, she looks a lot better, she feels a lot better. And because the author, I think, as well, is fat, I think she's definitely bringing her own experience to that.
That's a great example. And I think it's a great counterpoint to my little mini rant that I was just going on, which is the reminder that anything can be done well. There is no idea or concept that we actually should just write off and I should just say, oh, I never want to see this again. Anything can be done in a way that is thoughtful and worthwhile. It's just a matter of, if you're going to grapple with topics that are sensitive and loaded for people in the real world, you have to think about it and you have to be willing to devote space in your story to exploring what these things mean for characters and readers alike. Hunger Games is actually another fine example of a character. I'm pretty sure there's a scene where Katniss looks in a mirror and is like, I look very skinny. I think it's while she's getting dressed up for some Hunger Games related event. It's been a minute since I read the Hunger Games, but it's because she's been, starving to death her whole life. And now she's going to be paraded out in front of these people. It's pretty central to the plot. Yeah, I think it's just a thing that the almost appropriation of the experience of being othered based on body size is something that experience can be applied usefully to a character regardless of the character's size. It just has to be done thoughtfully. In the real world, there are not many people who are experiencing a lot of hardships on the basis of being too thin. There are some, but there are not many.
Yeah, I think it's that element of you can be self-conscious about anything, right? That's how people's brains work. You can find anything about yourself to pick apart. I mean, I'm a fairly scrawny person. I've been self-conscious about that, particularly as a trans man. I've had people call me anorexic and stuff in secondary school. I just can't keep on weight. But at the same time, I'm that experience is not the same as being constantly othered on a societal level where everything is stacked against you, where every interaction at the doctor's is biased.
Yeah, and differentiating between individual and systemic experience, which is, I think, particularly difficult to do when it comes to the body, because our relationships with our body are so individual. And we're not great at thinking about, okay, on an individual level, I experience my body this way, or my own feelings of insecurity are about this thing. And being able to differentiate that from what is the societal expectation and what are the societal barriers. What would it be like to not be able to fit in chairs a lot of places? What would it be like to be consistently treated by other people in the way that fat people, and particularly very fat people, get treated just out in the world? What would it be like to not be able to buy a t-shirt without having to pay $85 for it at Torrid? Systemic concerns, I think, I guess I'll add on to my what would I like to see more of? I would like to see more thinking about fat representation in SFF as being something that could interface with systemic issues, rather than it being a question of how does one individual character individually feel about their own body. I'd love for writers to start exploring how do fat characters' bodies fit or not fit into the world, literally.
Yeah, I feel that's something that I've absolutely never seen, which is such a shame. And I think also any marginalized identity that someone has is going to have a knock-on effect on any others that they might have. How are these things in your world also going to interact? I feel that's also something that I've particularly not seen with fat characters, maybe sometimes with queer characters of colour. I would say less in speculative settings usually, and more in contemporary settings, but it would definitely be interesting to see.
Yeah, no, I would set it almost as a challenge to fellow writers. This is a space where there's a lot of room to explore, and that should be what SFF is about, is imagining new things.
Is there anything that you've seen a pattern of that you think could be improved in some way, maybe?
A pet peeve, honestly, is that fat characters seem to shrink in adaptation. When they are moving from the page to the screen, they go from fat to curvy or from fat to thin. And a lot of fat representation disappears in adaptation. I would love for that to not happen. It makes me quite sad that when it comes to actually casting a fat actor, looking visibly at a fat person, there's less space for that. And I would love for that to change. Adaptations could even be a place to add in body diversity. If a text doesn't call for a character to have a certain body size. An actor of any size could play that role.
Actually, one thing that I was thinking about coming up to this that just reminded me of is this thing of like, in like the early 2000s, you'd read a book. If a character wasn't explicitly described as a person of colour, you were just supposed to assume they were white. And I feel like that is now changing. But for fat characters, I feel like that's not the norm at all. Like there's just an assumption that people aren't unless they are explicitly confirmed to be.
And maybe not even then, right? Maybe even if they are explicitly described as being fat, that could still be pulled away in the adaptation.
Exactly.
That is an area where we have made, I would say, no progress so far.
Mm-hmm.
I hope to see that change. Other than that, in terms of pet peeves, I think it's really easy to name a lot of unpleasant stereotypes about fatness that may be overrepresented in SFF. Fat characters as lazy villains, fat characters as comic relief sidekicks, fat characters never being love interests. I actually don't want to say sweepingly like that all of those things are things that should change, because I think that any of those tropes could be part of good and robust representation if we just had more. So I wouldn't say like I want the trope of the fat comic relief character to die. I don't know. I know a lot of funny fat people in real life. I think that could be a great thing to have represented, and a funny secondary character can be like extremely beloved. It just is not, it's not enough. And so it brings me back to the point of like, just more.
Yeah, I have to wonder as well how many people even know that like sensitivity readers are out there for this.
Yeah. No, I doubt it's a thing that is honestly even on most people's radar at this point as being part of how you would think about like creating a diverse world when you write. And I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk about it, because I think it's so important.
Before we close out the episode, could we maybe hear a little bit more from you about your young adult novel, Queen of All, for the bookworms listening who are looking for more?
You would think at some point after writing a book, querying a book, publishing a book, promoting a book, 3 years later, I would be able to give a coherent plot summary of the book. This I cannot do, but I can talk about vibes. This is always what I kind of default to. Queen of All is sort of a classic coming-of-age adventure fantasy story about a young girl who lives a pretty sheltered and pretty unhappy life, whose best friend is kind of summoned to the palace where they discover a lot of deep and sometimes fairly dark secrets about the world that they live in. And also there's magic. It's very much inspired by the YA fantasy that I grew up with. It's a coming out as well as a coming of age narrative, very character focused. It's the first in a trilogy. Books 2 and 3 are forthcoming.
For people who want to check out Queen of All or check out more of your work, where can people find you?
So I'm a little bit hard to find. I'm off socials pretty much at the moment. My website is anyajosephs.com/writing. If you go to just anyajosephs.com, it takes you to my therapist website. You can click around and find the hidden hyperlink to the writing page, but it's a little hard to find. So put that / in there. There you'll find a list of everything that I have out there, links to much of my short fiction that's been published, and of course, a link to Queen of All. Queen of All is also available wherever books are sold from all of the big online retailers. And because it's a small press book, your local bookstore may or may not have it in stock, probably not, but anywhere can order it for you if you'd like to pick up a copy.
And thank you so much for coming on. This was such a good conversation.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. This was such good fun. It's such an important subject, and it's something that's like really near and dear to me. And I guess what I will close by saying is that in writing this book and in my practice, I have really seen how much the ideas that we have about bodies and the kind of animus towards fat people and fatness, it's a thing that really destroys people's lives. And I think that with the right representation, like the power of stories is our ability to change the stories that we tell about ourselves in the world. And I think there's so much hope and so much good to be done through the power that SFF has to imagine whole new worlds.
That was so beautiful.
So next time for our second Ahistorical Autumn episode, we will be doing Song of the Huntress by Lucy Holland. We have previously done Sister Song by Lucy Holland, and this is a book set in the same world, but not technically a sequel, although it's set several hundred years later. That is all I'll say on that subject. Very excited for someone to read it. And until then, you're always welcome to the Bookcase.
Don't forget to scratch the cat on your way out. Thank you for listening to The Hidden Bookcase, a production of Planar Prod. On this episode, you heard Anya Josephs, Morgan Greensmith, and Soren Barwood discussing fat representation in science fiction and fantasy. A huge thank you to Anya Josephs for guesting on this episode. You were fantastic. You can find Joseph's writing and more information about Queen of All on their website, anyajosephs.com/writing. The link is also in the show notes. You can find The Hidden Bookcase on Twitter at Hidden Bookcase and on Instagram, Facebook, Tumblr and TikTok at Hidden Bookcase Podcast. Find out more about Plain Up Prod at plainupprod.com. Know what we should read next, and want to chat to us about what you thought of this episode? You can reach us at thehiddenbookcase@gmail.com, send us a DM on social media, or come chat with your fellow bookworms in our growing Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Want to support The Hidden Bookcase? Support us on Patreon for bonus episodes, audio outtakes, playlists, and other extras. Buy a book through our bookshop.org page, or consider leaving us a rating or review or telling a friend how to find us. Your whispers are the best way for bookworms to discover our show. For our next episode, which will be out on September 2nd, we'll be continuing A Historical Autumn with Song of the Huntress by Lucy Holland. We hope to see you then, and in the meantime, you're always welcome through the bookcase.